here. All right, welcome everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be. I'm delighted to be hosting this event, ITSM Tool Implementation, 2 Decades of Lessons Learned. Our presenter, Akshay Anand, who needs no introduction, has graciously returned to present an updated version of this presentation, which he delivered during the May 4th or May ITIL 4 event, which you all might remember if you attended. Just a quick note, if you took the survey, I encourage you to share your thoughts and insights that you gained with your fellow attendees in chat. I will be sending out a more official report and survey results in the next week or two, and may follow up with an actual hosted event, but to be determined. The presentation is going to last roughly 35 to 40 minutes with time left over in Q&A, but also feel free to add your questions to the Q&A panel, and we'll address them as they come in or wait till the end. I'll leave it up to Akshay to decide. But please put your questions in Q&A. It's a lot easier for me to monitor. But feel free to converse with your fellow attendees in the chat. Everyone will be on mute, but if you want to ask a question or interact, please raise your hand. I'll do my best to recognize that you're raising your hand and take you off mute so you can ask a question. As usual, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ITSM website within 5 business days. All right, well, with that out of the way, let me turn it over to Akshay.
All right, well, thank you, Mitch. And as always, thank you for having me. Mitch and I go back some years. I think he and a number of others have been working very hard behind the scenes with ITIL 4. I think I would go so far as to say they have reviewed and commented on every single ITIL 4 publication to date. And that's just a testament of, to their efforts, to their passion, to their zeal for service management. And, I don't think ITIL 4 would have been as successful, as robust, as resilient if it had not been for the efforts of many people such as Mitch and the team that he's been sort of coordinating behind the scenes to get a lot of this done. So from me to, I don't know who's on this webinar, but from me to Mitch and to the others, heartfelt thank you for all the support you've shown Axelos and ITIL 4 over the years. I say this also partly because I am shifting jobs very soon, and I am actually going to work for a tool company, a product company. And no doubt I'll be applying some of these lessons in my work there, but I'll also be hopefully able to come back to this group and offer fresher perspectives on modern ways of working in service management next year and year after that and so on. So let's get on with the presentation. See a couple of it was just Mitch. Right. You can see me on camera, but that's who I am. My title right now is Product Ambassador for ITIL. I work for a company called Axelos, based here in London. Axelos is the company that publishes the guidance, the exams, the certificates, and so on. And for the last 4 years, I have been the Product Ambassador for ITIL, and that's been twofold. The first is to be part of the architecture and sometimes authoring team for the books themselves, bringing to bear all my sort of experience working primarily in ITSM consulting in North America as well as across Europe. But the second part of my role is to engage with the community in forums such as this, to talk about some of the things that ITIL 4 has to offer and how we can apply some of the concepts of ITIL 4 to unlock value in our organizations. For those of you listening before Mitch hit the record button, outside of my love for service management, as I mentioned, I'm a big hard rock, heavy metal type of guy, although my tastes extend far beyond that. Also a big comic book fan, as you can see from what I've got behind me in my home office. Big Lego fan as well. That Twitter handle sees a little bit of activity every now and again. I think I read Twitter more than I actually contribute to it, but you can always reach me on LinkedIn at Blowboy. You can also connect with me on, you can reach me on Twitter at Blowboy. You can also reach me on LinkedIn if you haven't already connected with me. Happy to connect with you, but all I would say is please do attach a note to your connection request, because I do get quite a few of them, and I reject anything that doesn't have an explanation. Just say something like you attended this session, and I'd be more than happy to accept the connection request. So all that boring stuff aside, let's get into some of the interesting bits. I believe Mitch shared a survey with everyone in the lead up to this presentation. And he shared a lot of that data with me, the results. I've pulled out a couple of stats that I thought were interesting, and perhaps this is something that we can discuss more in the Q&A. So it has some relevance to what we're going to be talking about in terms of tool implementations, but I think there are other broader considerations to think about. The first thing that I thought was interesting was how long have people had their current ITSM tool? And I was actually quite surprised by the result, because from at least my experience, service management tools have been fairly mature, dare I use that word, and to see that most people were relatively new to their ITSM tools, so 1 to 3 years, and indeed some had them less than a year, is quite interesting to me. I mean, we do see a significant number having it 5 years plus, but to be honest, I expected the bar chart to skew more in that direction. And I wonder whether some of this has been driven by, for example, the cost cutting that we've seen in response to the lockdowns and COVID, whether some of it has been that organizations have realized that their tool set is not fit for a remote first way of working or remote first student populace. And I'd be interested to have an open discussion about that. But I thought it's interesting that a lot of the people who responded to the poll were relatively early in their service management tool journey, or they may have only had this current generation or this current tool in the last couple of years, maybe having switched from some other legacy tool that they had for decades. I don't know. As the title says, this is a totally unscientific poll. The other totally unscientific poll result that I wanted to share was trying to see what the spread was in terms of the different modules that people were using. And, I think it was fairly expected to see that most people were going to rate very highly or say that they were using the sort of usual mature ITSM processes of incident, request, and change. I was quite interested to see knowledge there, to be honest. I've been part of way too many service management tool implementations where knowledge management has been limited to a sort of wiki style intranet sort of setup within the tool where, well, I think I've said it on a podcast, so I'm happy to say it openly now. Oftentimes knowledge goes to die. Again, I'd be interested to see how people are actually using the knowledge management module. The thing that did surprise me, and I have to be honest, alarmed me slightly, was that problem management ranked fairly low, or rather lower than what I expected. And I'm not quite sure if I can read much into this, but it was only half the people polled. There were about 90 respondents, so it's about half the people polled that actually said that they were using the problem management module. Now, again, totally unscientific. It could be that people got bored with the survey by this point and they just were clicking through as quickly as possible. So maybe the use of problem management is much higher than what the data actually indicates. But it'd be interesting to, again, have an open discussion about why problem management might seem to be so low. Is it an issue with the perceived value of problem management, and how can we remedy that? So again, there's a couple of topics to throw out to the open Q&A.
And
so,
Akshay, my interjection, it may be that the problem management module is not being used, but they may be managing problem management in a different tool, right? Maybe a spreadsheet, maybe a some other PDF or something like that. And at USC, we were kind of doing it that way first before we actually implemented it within the application.
It could be. As I said, the title says that this is a totally unscientific poll.
Yes, usually context around it, right?
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, this is something to discuss later on, and I think, Mitch, these could also be a couple of data points that you might want to drill down into for future workshops and sort of community events. So what can we do to make to improve the uptake of problem management, for example. So, let's talk about the lessons from tool implementations. So I chose this picture because I thought it's, a lot of times we see the tools when they're finished, when they're being used. That's most people's perception of the tool, especially our end users. They only see the finished product. They never get to see the scaffolding, the guts of it. And sometimes this is intentional. Sometimes it helps to limit the amount of transparency. But oftentimes we can see that it can lead to unforeseen or indeed bad consequences. And that's really what we're going to be talking about through the rest of the 40-ish minutes. What can we do to improve the way in which our tool implementations land, get better traction, get better buying, get better return on value, if not better return on investment. So a couple of recaps on some terminology, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. So I'm going to breeze through these next couple of slides. A service is, and we should hopefully be familiar with the acronym VOCR at this point, whether it's the VOCR of ITIL version 3 or the VOCR of ITIL 4. A service is a means of co-creating value by creating outcomes that our consumers want without those consumers having to manage specific costs and risks. So it's a very standard definition of what a service is. But I think with ITIL 4, we went one step further and we emphasized that value, though, is co-created, which is a big shift from prior versions of ITIL, but others of service management literature. Value is co-created. It takes two to tango. It's not just a provider delivering value. So value is co-created, but more importantly, value is subjective. What might be valuable for you might not be valuable to the next person along. The example I give for this is, well, there are a couple of examples I can give. Here in Europe, and I believe in the US as well, but I'm sure Mitch will be happy to correct me. We have contactless payments systems, not just the Apple Pay, Google Wallet type of systems, but our cards have that sort of chip where you can just tap it. And I think right now in the UK, you can pay up to £100 without having to put in a PIN number. You can just tap the card. And that's clearly very valuable for a lot of people. But we now have Apple Pay, Google Wallet, etc., which is again very useful for a lot of people. But what happens if you are like my parents? I mean, God knows, they're lovely people, but they're not necessarily the most tech savvy people. So would a service which only accepts Apple Pay or Google Wallet be as valuable to them? What about people who have no fixed abode? So refugees, homeless people, and so on. Without a fixed abode, they can't necessarily get a bank account. Without a bank account, they can't get a debit card. Without a debit card, and certainly no fixed means of income, they might struggle to access the technology that they need in order to make these payments. So value is very, very subjective, and it's not universal. This is the other big change that ITIL 4 has introduced. The perception of value is not uniform. And what we find is that the subjectivity of that value is driven, that perception of value is driven through the experience the consumer has at various touch points. Now, those of you who have done some of the ITIL 4 courses will recognize this diagram as being the customer journey map, showing how customers and providers, or consumers and providers, interact through different stages of a customer journey, all the way from exploring needs and articulated or unarticulated needs, all the way to realizing value through those series of interactions. This can be a very quick process. This can be a very lengthy process. It really depends on the context. But the touch points that the consumer has with the service provider drives feelings and emotions, which in turn can influence perception. If you have a really good experience with your service provider, even though you might not get the best outcome you're looking for, you're still satisfied. If you're unhappy with your consumer, a good service outcome is still likely to be accepted in a hostile way. So experience at these touch points is what drives perception. So what does this mean in terms of tool implementations? It means that we need to focus on value. And again, those who have done some ITIL 4 study will recognize this as being one of the guiding principles in ITIL 4, focusing on value. We need to make sure that whatever work that we do, whatever tool implementations we're putting out there, we are creating, allowing people to unlock as much value. We are creating as much value as we possibly can for the organization. But this leads to a secondary question, which is, whom are we creating value for? And in my experience, a lot of tool implementation projects tend, especially if you're ITSM tool implementations, tend to focus on some very well-defined stakeholders like the general user base, the service desk, and to an extent the platform team, right? It makes sense. We want to enable the service desk by deflecting calls, allowing users to look up a self-service portal, to log their requests. And of course, the platform team is learning more, and of course, they're in gainful employment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're focused on value. There's nothing wrong with this, except there can be stakeholders who are not actually involved with the project, with the platform implementation, but for whom value is also crucial. Because if you don't create value for them, you are instead possibly creating risks for the organization. So for example, if you're not following all the applicable laws and regulations and internal policies around information security and confidentiality and all that, you are creating legal risks for your organization. If you're not demonstrating that audit and compliance teams can derive the data and the reports that they need, then you are creating more work for them, which, as we all know, comes back and bites us because we're the ones having to do all that reporting work. If you're not creating value for your finance teams or your procurement teams by following and adhering to their processes and policies, then you are creating risks for them, which again can come back and bite you in a future budgetary cycle. Now, again, legal, audit, compliance, finance, procurement, they're not necessarily using the tool day to day. They might be part of that user population, but they're not necessarily going to be part of the project to implement that tool. But if you're not taking care of their value propositions, then you are creating risks for them. Typically, what I've seen is that these groups tend to defer to a PMO. They tend to say, these are the constraints, these are the policies, etc. by the PMO. They may be available for ad hoc consultation, but you need to then leverage the PMO to make sure that you are creating value for them. The second one is to manage a product and not just a project. I apologize, the title of the slide should say not just a project. The way to think about this is to think about how resources scale up and down over time. And typically we see projects will scale up as they're delivering work, they'll hit a peak at some point. That's when the most work is happening. And as the project's being delivered and things will start to wind down. But what we most commonly see is that they wind down all the way down to zero. So beyond a small amount of budget to pay someone to install a patch, check that licenses are in compliance, manage user onboarding, offboarding, etc. But outside of that budget, outside of that resource, there typically is no one available to execute on minor upgrades, minor tweaks to a form or a workflow, putting in something new, something that's small but new, in to reflect perhaps the way a business unit has decided to change their ways of working, or you've merged with another team, whatever it might be. You don't have the resources to reflect these changes. So the next time you want to actually execute a change, you have to ramp all the way back up from zero. And between those projects, the organization, in effect, has to fold itself around that tool implementation rather than making that tool implementation work for the organization. And I think that's a bad thing when an organization has to change itself in order to fit the tool. So what can we do to remedy this? Well, we can invest in a stable product team. And this was something that I saw in the poll results, and I'm quite gratified by. So I'm possibly preaching to the choir here, but it's better to have a small, stable product team, let's say 3, 5, max 9 or 10 people. But that team is able to not only do your admin work and your maintenance work, but they're also able to focus on delivering small bits and pieces of work tweaks, new functionality, whatever it might be, over time. And that makes the platform, the product, much more responsive to the needs of your user base. Once you have the stable product team in place, you can either backfill or supplement or augment the resources you have anytime you have a big chunk of work that's coming up. So that way you are not only working with a stable product team, but you're also bringing in you're flexing to have project teams as and when necessary. So you're managing not just a product, but you're managing a mix of product and projects. And this allows you to adopt that continual improvement model. You know, your projects are the ones that might be delivering the larger chunks of work where you're revisiting the vision and, you know, going through defining a target state and a current state, doing that gap analysis, doing all that good workshopping, and making sure that you're introducing those larger bits of transformation into your organization. But having that stable product team allows you to be able to progress iteratively with feedback, where you are looking at the feedback that's coming in from your users, you're making those tweaks, you're adding that little bits of functionality, and then you're regathering the feedback from those stakeholders, and you're continually improving over time. This also allows you to distinguish between MVP and MMP. MMP, for those, well, MVP, for those of you who are not aware, stands for minimum viable product. It's the smallest set of features or capabilities that allows the organization to learn something about how that tool is being used and to make improvements. MMP is minimum marketable product, sometimes also known as minimum lovable product. And this is a larger collection of features or capabilities that allows the tool to be adopted at scale. So MMP is something that excites a very small bunch of, let's say, super users, early adopters, these types of people. But to have mass traction, you need to think about MMP instead. So you can still start to deliver benefits to your organization by focusing on those early tweaks, the prototyping with a small set of users, testing out different features, etc. There will still be some amount of rework that's going to be happening here, or some amount of duplication of work, like you know, swivel chairing between two different tool sets. But once you hit a minimum set of features that you think will allow the majority of the organization to get their jobs done, that's when you launch. That's when you know you have MMP, minimum marketable product, and you will see that you will significantly scale benefits across the organization. At the same time, if you have that product approach, you will also recognize that sometimes, because of context change, the way changes to how the business is being run, or what business is being done, changes to the internal context, etc., you may find that there are certain features or certain sets of features which are no longer delivering benefit into the organization. They're perhaps not being used as much, or their use is following the old way of working, and there's now a new way of working. And having that product mindset allows you to recognize that these features or bundles of features have reached a natural end of life. And it allows you to have conversations about what you're going to do once you've hit end of life. Are you going to replace it with something, that specific feature or capability? Are you going to replace the entire tool set if the conversations are happening at this level? Are you going to bring in another tool and provide an integration? Are you going to try to move legacy teams off in some way? These are the sorts of conversations you can have that helps you push that value message back into your organization. So think about MVP, MMP, and certainly think about end of life. Am I going too fast? Just want to have a quick check that I'm not speaking too fast. Mitch, all okay?
No, you're good. I think a quick question back on the previous slide. So the MVP obviously is minimal viable product. Get it out, launch it, get some feedback, and then start to realize investment or value or a return on investment. From that time scale, could it vary the length of time between seeing return on value based on what you are launching, what your minimum viable product is, and how do you gauge for something like that?
It's a good question. The typical consultant answer is, of course, it depends. I'll give you an example. So I was head of service management at Macmillan Publishing some years ago. And as part of my role, I was also sort of the product owner for ServiceNow, if I can call it that. We're a relatively small organization, but I enjoyed the work. Not only working up here, but also working down here as well. So when we were setting up the self-service portal, the request portal, we worked with our service desk teams to try to automate a specific type of request, right? Let's say access to a publishing production system. And we understood what the request experience was going to be, and we tweaked that experience. But we couldn't launch with just that one request type. We needed to make sure that we captured at least 80% of all request types that were currently being handled in the new portal. And that would have been MMP. So MVP would have been focused on, let's study how people are using how people use a portal to submit a request, tweak that so that we minimize the amount of friction, minimize the amount of clicks, whatever it might be. And then once we've got that, we then start to scale that up to add more and more request types until we hit a certain threshold where we say, this will now be more than enough to replace the legacy tool. We still have work to do, and maybe we provide a other type of request to capture the 20% we didn't get. But then over time, we build out the 20% as well, but we can launch with 80%. So our MP took, if memory serves, about 3 sprints, about 3 2-week sprints, right? First 2 weeks to prototype, next 2 weeks to observe, next 2 weeks to tweak and retest, right? So it took about 6 weeks. But then it took another 2 months after that to get all the other request types up and running before we released it to everybody. So you might see those types of ratios play out in your workplace as well.
Okay, that's good. It makes me think of an example of a recent catalog improvement made. We made over 50 changes to catalog, quick, easy, minimal viable product changes, but the MMP is going to be, it's going to take us a long time to realize that based on current use and the feedback we get from it. So that's a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you can definitely say it'll take you longer. It doesn't have to be like another year before you see it. It's all relative. If your MMP took 4 weeks, your MVP took 4 weeks, your MMP might take, let's say 3 months. You know, you have to judge that. And the reason why we took the time is because we didn't want people duplicating work where they had to, you know, only half the request could be in one tool, the other half of the request could be in another tool. So we had to find a good balance, a good tipping point. Sorry. It worked out okay, but you know, experience may vary. I can see a few other messages in the chat, which I'm not going to look at now, but I'll come back to unless there's something.
They're just my stuff. I'm just commenting. So yeah.
All right. So the next one, investing in marketing and communication. This is something that's always flabbergasted me that we don't do this enough. Typically, the platform team, the development team issues comms to the users. You know, here's a Word document. Here's an email with an attached PDF. Here's a link with a bunch of videos. But the platform team is the one communicating directly to users. And clearly there are different channels, different formats of communication that we can leverage. Emails, chats, intranet, or the existing self-service portal, whatever it might be. What I think, and this works, to a large extent it works, but I think we can improve on this, especially if we're working across a lot of remote or hybrid or distributed workforce. We can work better if we were to include some sort of super user or local champion who can take our message and make sure it hits the right people at the right time. A lot of these teams, a lot of these business teams, a lot of the other IT teams have weekly catch-ups, sometimes monthly catch-ups. As a centralized product team or platform team, I might not necessarily know what the cadence of those discussions might be. But if I cultivate a network of those super users, I can make sure that we schedule in the comms at an appropriate time and we know that it will land. We know that the message is getting out there. But the other advantage to having those super users and champions is that we are able to essentially foster or nurture a feedback loop, because these same people can come back to us and say, well, this question came up and I wasn't able to answer it based on the materials you gave me. Or uh, this particular person had a great idea for a feature that could make this make their lives a lot better, and I agree with them. So there's a great feedback loop that you can also cultivate here, which can add to your backlog as a product team. Again, this is all about making sure you can create as much value, unlock as much value, and having these feedback loops are absolutely essential to be able to do that. But the other thing that the super users and champions can do is to contextualize the message. So the same self-service portal, if it's being described to an HR team, the HR super user or the HR champion could say, remember last week or last month when Workday went down and we were trying to figure out how to do this. Well, here's exactly how you were to do it. But then to an engineering team, you might say, well, if you put something into Slack, we've got an integration in the back end that Slack will immediately log a ticket with us through this, or you can do it through the self-service portal, or you can look up updates through the self-service portal. So again, you're contextualizing the message to the audience that needs to hear it. You're not creating a universal message that you're hoping everyone will understand. Too often I've seen this universal message approach. And like I said, to an extent it works, but we would create a much better experience if we start to cultivate these super users, these champions, these, dare I say it, ambassadors from across our organization to be able to take our messages into their teams. On that theme of comms, the next one is don't rely on a document on SharePoint. Again, SharePoint, intranet, whatever it might be. All too often we see this, right? There's a great document with lots of screenshots. Maybe there's even a video showing people how to do things, but that piece of knowledge, that artifact, is stuck on an intranet or a wiki or somewhere in the self-service portal. It might be bookmarked, but over time it will be forgotten. That bookmark that page will be archived. People will lose access to that information, or they'll forget to find how to find it. It just becomes more and more complicated. I'm not saying don't have a document on SharePoint. What I'm saying is invest in different channels or media. Invest certainly in that document, but what about brown bag lunches or sort of show and tell type of thing? Now that we're unlocking, maybe we can host something in the cafeteria, for example. Videos, I've already mentioned that. Think about it this way: when something breaks down, when my washing machine broke down, I didn't try to read the manual. I went to YouTube, put in my washing machine make and model and the type of problem I was having, and I watched the results, right? Because I find it easier to consume that sort of information visually through these videos. Maybe you can have, I forget the phrase off the top of my head, but we used to have, I think the phrase I've heard was floor walkers, right? People who might be from the central product team, but you're going to the Gemba, as it were, and you're sitting down with people, you're observing how they work, you're helping them work better, and they'll remember that. So invest in multiple user training formats. But regardless of what training format you invest in, remember to always reiterate and reinforce the same message. Don't say you can log this type of an incident on the self-service portal on the document, but in a different channel or a different artifact somewhere. Don't say you have to call the service desk to be able to log this type of ticket. You've got to make sure you're consistent in your messaging. The next one, don't get gas. I love the acronym. It was introduced to me by a photographer friend on a podcast I did on creativity in IT. GAS stands for Gear Acquisition Syndrome. It's this belief that if the shinier the tool, the better the outcomes will be. Now, unfortunately, my electric guitar is packed because I just came back from a lesson, but I thought that this was a really apt image to sell this message. Having more guitars, I have an acoustic, I have 2 electrics, I have an amp, does not make me a good guitarist. I'm sorry to say. I've come to that shocking conclusion after 10 years of a midlife crisis. So in the workplace, don't get sucked into gear acquisition syndrome. Yes, we have a lot of really good and really cool tech out there, But just because we can automate something, just because we can use automation in a particular place, doesn't mean we should. And it's always a judgment call whether we should or we shouldn't. One place where we shouldn't, of course, is to replace human empathy. And I'll come to that in a bit. But, we've all been part of these CMDB projects where, somebody has said, wow, isn't it cool how much data we can get from SCCM or some of the other discovery tools? We need all these fields in our CMDB. What are they going to use it for? They don't know, but they're excited that they can get it and they can see all this data and they can do whatever they want with it. But is that actually adding value back into the business? Is that allowing the organization to create its outcomes faster, more efficiently, more effectively, with a better experience? In a lot of cases, no. And it is a difficult discussion to have, but oftentimes you've got to be able to step away from the cool tech and say what we have is sufficient and it suffices, and we don't need to invest more in this field. I mentioned don't remove human cognition and empathy. For those of you who have watched Little Britain, a very old show now, there was this lady character who worked in I think a call center type of situation, and she would always say, "Computer says no," right? That was her catchphrase. How often have we been trying to call? How often have we tried to call, for example, our local parcel company to say, you know what, this parcel delivery is really important, but my kid is sick. I need to take them to the doctor. I'll be back, but there's 1 hour in my delivery window where you might try to make that delivery. Can you please try to maybe come an hour later? But the self-service portal we have, the way we have to contact the service provider is basically through that computer, and computer says no, right? Now, that's an extreme example. I'm sure there are efficiencies of scope, efficiencies of scale that the service provider is also trying to manage. But one tool that I think is very useful to us as service management professionals is what you see on screen, the empathy map canvas. And I've put a link to this page on Medium, which explains how to use the empathy map canvas. This allows us to, in a workshop setting, to be able to understand what our customers, our users are going through. And equally, well, I'll come to this point secondary. It allows us to put ourselves into the minds of our users. It's a great supplement to persona mapping, if you've ever done that. But as soon as you identify a persona, you can use the empathy map canvas to understand, well, what are these people trying to do? What are they trying to say to us? What are they seeing? What are their pain points? What are they trying to gain? And so on. But equally, if we were to mirror this conversation, we can then say, well, when we on the service desk or we in the service management organization say something, what are they hearing? Because what I'm saying might be misinterpreted. Classic example, when I call my help desk to raise a ticket or log something in the self-service portal, it might be really important to me, right? But I'm told, well, in the grand scheme of things, your ticket is a P5 and it's going to take 3 to 5 days for someone to get back to you. How do you think that makes me feel, right? So I'd encourage using this empathy map canvas, or rather mirroring the empathy map canvas, to understand not only what are our teams saying to our users, but equally, what are the users hearing and how is that landing? Or we can use it for our own teams to say, when a consumer speaks to us, when a user speaks to us, what are they trying to say? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to say? But equally understand what words they are using and how you might be misinterpreting those words. Or equally, when I, in the service management organization, take an action, which I believe to be correct and following the policies and all that sort of good stuff that I have to abide by, what is the experience of the person on the other side of that conversation? Right, so that having empathy or trying to get into the minds of the people we are servicing helps us improve how we communicate. And I think this is the last point to raise before we go into the Q&A, is don't turn off other channels of communication. I think we do this way too often as an industry, where we've got this new shiny self-service portal, and what's the immediate reaction? we switch off emails to the service desk, or we switch off the phone lines to the service desk. I remember going to a conference where I was part of a panel discussion talking about ITIL 4, and this lady stood up at the end of it during the Q&A and said, "Will ITIL 4 help me turn off emails to the service desk so I can force all my users to go to the self-service portal?" And my response is still the same today as what it was then, which is we are in service to our consumers. That is the whole point of being in service management. That's why we're managing this thing called a service. We are in service to our users. We have to go where our users are working. And we have to help them work as much as we can. This is not about us and what we want. To an extent it is, but the broad message is we need to focus on what our consumers are trying to do, what our users are trying to do. So rather than turning off these other channels of communication, instead create incentives and disincentives. So you could say, as part of your regular comms, we've got this new shiny portal. Incidents or requests raised by the portal will be given first priority. We promise that we will look at it within 4 hours or within 2 hours. If you send in an email, we only go through our emails once a day. So you can wait, you might have to wait until tomorrow to get a response. So you're creating a set of incentives to drive traffic to the portal, but you're not turning off, you're only disincentivizing your legacy ways of working. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, the less tech savvy or the people who have that sort of intellectual muscle memory, nothing is more natural to them than picking up the phone or firing off an email to the service desk. They don't necessarily care about the self-service portal. If you were to say, we're not going to accept it, you're just going to, you're effectively destroying value. You're diminishing the value of your self-service portal because you're setting yourself up as the bad guys, right? So creative incentives and disincentives. Think of the classic iron triangle from project management: time, quality, cost, right? Those are 3 levers that you can start to use. It's going to take longer if you don't use the portal. If you're working in a sort of shared services unit where you're sort of charging back to get your budget for the year, as it were, you could say, well, manning the phones or monitoring the emails is going to cost more. We want people to use the self-service portal. That's where the costs are going to go less. Or you could say, we can provide a slicker experience, a faster experience if you use the portal than if you use the other means. So you can create a robust set of incentives and disincentives. So let's wrap up and then we can go into the Q&A. Hopefully people are still awake. So to wrap up, first, focus on value from multiple stakeholders. Second, manage products and projects. In doing so, be sure to balance MVP and MMP. Invest in marketing and communications, not just a single fire and forget type of thing, but build in those feedback loops. Use your internal comms if you have one, or set up some sort of system of internal comms that allows people to feedback as well. Don't get gas, don't get gear acquisition syndrome. You might be able to achieve the same outcomes with less tech. Invest in multiple training formats or multiple communication formats because not everybody likes to read a document. Retain human cognition and empathy as much as possible. Try to avoid the computer says no syndrome, and don't abruptly turn off old ways of working. If you're looking for more information on some of the ITIL 4 concepts like the guiding principles and the customer journey map, there's a couple of links in this deck that will take you to the Axelos website where you can find out more information about these the modules which contain these concepts like foundation, drive stakeholder value, and others. I've also written a blog post based on this presentation for Atlassian. So if you fire up your browser and search for Akshay Anand Atlassian blog, you will find a blog post where I summarize 3 of these tips. And I believe they should be publishing another 3 or expanding on that article at the end of this month. So you may find that a useful read to share if people don't want to watch a recording of a Zoom webinar. With that said, Mitch, I'm done. I hope I didn't bore everyone, but we can talk
I,
about
I, I think
Q&A now.
this is excellent. Obviously, the survey results are very telling about what our current state is, right, around the different communication channels and how they manage prioritization and demand, and who actually does the development work. There were just a couple comments in chat. Sounds like Jason did get his answer about the resourcing challenges. I heard Happy Signals, everybody knows who they are, our great customer experience company. Don't have any direct experience with them, but I've talked to their marketing people several times. Their survey once reported that the portal is the worst experience, for our customers. And if we're going to drive people from email to portal or some other thing, that experience has to be better. So how do you address that, right? Akshay, when you want to move them to more self-service or some other experience, how do you ensure that that experience is going to be better than email as an incentive tactic as opposed to decentive tactic, like we're going to answer your email in 3 days versus if you go to the portal?
Again, consultant answer, it depends.
Yeah.
You could say, look, I mean, one example, again, based on something we did at Macmillan, you could do password resets using our self-service portal. So we said, look, you can call us and we'll do it, and we'll give you a reset a temporary password over the phone, or you can go to the self-service portal and you click one button called reset my password and it'll be done. So you can spend 3-4 minutes waiting for us to pick up the phone, explain the situation you're in, wait for us to fill out the necessary forms on our side, hit that send button, reset it, or you can go to the self-service portal and it's really easy to use. It's this giant button on the front page called reset my password. So yeah, you've got to think about what sort of experiences people are looking for. Sometimes people just want to talk to somebody, right? There is no getting around that, and you need to be able to create that experience if it's needed.
Absolutely.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah. I think most of us in higher ed experience that, everyone still wants to do things by email. So just based on Jason's comment, I can assume that that's what everyone's feeling here. It's like email is the most prevalent in demand form of communication, but it's very hard to manage from a service management perspective. And reporting and all that good stuff. Anybody want to throw some questions?
Remember what I said, we are in service to our users, and we need to go where they are. So, this could be an opportunity to have a conversation with the heads of the different schools or departments or business units within your organization, within your higher ed organization, to say, look, this is how much email is currently being used. If we were to try to shift this quickly, it might not work. So how can we collectively come together to make this work? Is the self-service portal something that we are all signing up for? In which case, what are you as heads of department going to do to help us drive traffic to that self-service portal? Because our success is your success and vice versa. Equally, our failure is your failure and vice versa.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, don't quite say that abruptly.
Yes.
Find nicer words.
No, it's marketing the value of using the portal to our different business units, because we're very federated, and higher ed institutions are very federated. So just want to make a quick note. I added something in chat. Axel's been kind enough to give us a 15% discount. Any books, ITIL books on the TSO website, use the code EDUC. It's good till Friday, which is the 10th, right? Maybe. Well, anyway, the 10th at midnight UK time. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. Any other comments or closing remarks you want to make, Akshay? I don't see any questions coming in.
If people want to chat about some of the poll results, I think that might be something that we can do as well in the time we have left, if there's any appetite for that. We talked about how the distribution in terms of age of the tools, but also what modules of the tool were being used. So, happy to have a chat with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, and early, just kind of looking at the survey results and building out the report, I was pleased as well to see a majority of people managing backlogs through a product team, right? and a lot of people do have challenges with governance around demand for changes and enhancements. Some are taking the approach where more strategic types of changes go through sort of formal governance. More tactical operational changes go through the team to do the prioritization. So I'm glad to see that as well. Other things that kind of
sorry, Teresa was asking me to share my screen. Yeah, just give me a second. Teresa, was there a specific one that you wanted me to share? There were two graphs that I shared.
Okay. If you want to raise your hand, I can take off mute if anybody wants to chime in.
Both. Well, okay. I'll figure out how to do that. So this is the first. How long have you had the tool? And this is the second. What do you use your tool for?
By the way, Akshay, I don't know if something got lost in translation. I mean, you did an excellent job articulating the 1 to 2 years, but actually the survey results, most people have owned their tool for 5 to 10 years. So I'm not sure how that got messed up in the translation. But the survey results.
When I ran a pivot table, most of the count came in the 1 to 3. I mean, there's still a good chunk. I mean, if you look at 5 to 10 and 10 plus, that's 50%.
Well, I will check my answers and then confirm. So to be determined. I will double check to make sure I didn't run the wrong pivot table. I'm not an Excel expert by any means, but anyway, I will verify. So because it would surprise me as well if most people own their tool for 1 to 2 years or 1 to 3 years. But like I said, I'll verify.
It was a totally unscientific poll with a totally unscientific analysis. So caveat emptor.
Yes, I represent those comments, but that's fine. Just and the other interesting thing is when people talked about return on investment. I guess I wasn't surprised that people feel kind of mixed, like a partial return on investment. I think the biggest answers were like just taking more advantage of the capability of the tools. And kind of the flip side of that is that buying a Cadillac, so to speak, and not really taking advantage of it at all, right? Just using it for just minimal operational kinds of things, incident change requests, those kinds of things. A lot of people were reporting that they would see more value if they changed their tool, but I would almost ask, are you doing enough to maximize the current tool you have now? Is it a matter of just being frustrated and replacing the tool, or really taking the time to understand what your pain points are, right? So
I mean, a lot of times they might be looking to change their tools because they realize they need a simpler tool. They don't necessarily need to pay as much for a tool as they have been because they're not using all those features. So there is a case to be made to sort of moving to another quadrant in the Gartner Magic Quadrant, as it were. A lot of people are invested in ServiceNow, and clearly ServiceNow continues to deliver value create value in a lot of organizations and deliver the outcomes they want. But we also see that a lot of organizations might feel that ServiceNow is too expensive for what they're using it for. And, that's where you see a lot of churn, where people are going to, I mean, BMC is another behemoth, but people are going to BMC. They're looking at Freshworks. They're looking at Sherwell or Ivanti or Manage Engine or a host of other tools out there. Equally, you have some people who say, you know what, the capabilities of the platform we have are just not cutting it. We need to upscale. So
the customer experience officer at ServiceNow, he doesn't work there anymore. He works for a consulting company. He said the top 3 things that CIOs are looking for out of any tool, really, but pertaining to ServiceNow, but this really could apply to any tool, is return on investment, maximizing that return on investment, keeping it out of the box as possible, right? Avoiding extra customization, and ensuring you're using all of the features, accordingly, making sure you're getting that, adoption and business value out of it. So thought that was kind of interesting. Not surprising, but 3 things that CIOs are looking for out of their tool.
The really interesting thing is, my experience has been that whilst most organizations talk a good game around ROI, most of the project management offices or the way projects are managed don't set them up to be able to measure benefits over time, right? The project's done, the organization goes and focuses on something else. Very rarely do people come back and say, what can we quantify the benefits of this project that we executed last year? And are we meeting the goals of the business case, right? The other interesting thing is that in the case of tool implementations, unless you have baseline financial data, and I don't mean just the cost of the tools and the licenses, but what's the nominal cost of an incident? What's the nominal cost of a request? You know, how are you tracking that? Because if you can say that, look, the nominal cost of an incident, if we add up the agent time or the engineer's time, the nominal loss of productivity, and we give it a figure, it was $10 an hour. But with this new tool, we've cut that down to $8 an hour. Therefore, we have made a saving of $2 per incident. That's how you actually would go about calculating return on investment, by quantifying the benefit. But again, service, financial management for services, whether you're in the V3 world or ITIL4 world, very, very few organizations seem to go about creating that baseline of data from which they can measure and actually show real returns, or in some cases, maybe they're not making the returns, in which case is a return on value that they're seeking, like a better experience. You've shifted an internal NPS score, even though you're spending more, for example. But I don't see very many organizations creating baselines against which to assess a return.
I asked my colleagues, can you quantify productivity loss? Well, that's very hard for us to quantify productivity loss. But if you ask people if incidents are affecting their productivity, they're going to say yes. So how many hours did you lose? You may not be able to quantify it in dollars, but you can certainly start. If I lost 4 hours of productivity and I make an average salary of $60,000 a year, times that product hours over that year, you can start to come up with some numbers.
Absolutely. And nobody's asking for it to be absolutely accurate. The point is to create a baseline and apply the same measurement approaches to gauging the return, the post-implementation metrics, right? As long as you're being consistent, then you can prove or disprove benefit.
That's right.
But if you're not even going to capture that baseline in the first place, then you're spending money, certainly, and maybe people are patting themselves on the back that they executed a project, but who's tracking return?
Absolutely. Totally agree. Appreciate your time. It's 10 Pacific time, so we're at the top of the hour. This concludes our presentation. Thank you, Akshay, for your time. Your contact information is on the slide deck. I'll share out the deck. I will also share out the recording. If you have an idea that you want to, and a topic you want to present, reach out to me. I'll set up a meeting that we can figure out timing and giving you a platform to give your presentation. This was being recorded and it'll be available within 5 business days on the ITSM website. Thank you for your time and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Be in touch. Bye.